if we could first just talk about some of the language we are hearing from Donald Trump. And it was not just today in his news conference, but we've seen him repeatedly be talking about things like the racial identity of the vice president. He suggested today he doesn't care if it's Indian or black, but it's disrespectful to suggest it is both or to switch between the two. And I wonder, sir, if you have a reaction to that.
Yeah, I think it's disrespectful for him to comment on this in the way he has. I think that I read that almost 40 million Americans are of some kind of multiracial background, and they describe themselves that way. They should have the freedom to talk about themselves in the way in which they feel comfortable. But for some reason, Donald Trump thinks that he's the decider in chief of people's identities and gets to redefine it for them. That won't play well. That's why he is unfit to be president again. And that's, I think, a comment that will, along with his other comments, will go on to haunt him in this campaign.
Well, he said a lot today. We covered the better part of an hour with Donald Trump, and he also spoke to conditions with regard to crime and security in your town of Chicago. He was actually being asked about gun control, gun legislation, Congressman, at the time. Here's what Donald Trump said, and we'll have you respond.
And remember this, what is the toughest gun law in the United States? Chicago. On July 4th, 117 people were shot and 17 died. The toughest gun laws in the United States are in the city of Chicago. You know that. They had 117 people shot. Afghanistan does not have that.
So he compared the city of Chicago today to Afghanistan as all of us prepare to pack our bags to attend the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. Will it be possible to secure the city for this event? Is he right about what he's saying?
Chicago will be a wonderful place to come for the Democratic National Convention. I urge everyone to come for an excellent time. And I think that at the end of the day, the problem, one of the biggest problems that we have with regard to gun violence is that we don't have national laws that police against, for instance, the trafficking of guns that you can easily purchase in other states and bring to places like Chicago or other places with common sense gun control. I'm just chagrined that Mr. Trump would forget that just a few weeks ago, he was almost assassinated by someone with an AR-15 style rifle that should not be allowed to be purchased by a civilian. It's a weapon of war that almost killed him. And so I would hope that he would have a different approach on this issue, but unfortunately he does not.
Well, Congressman, it is worth pointing out that Donald Trump did take many questions from the media at Mar-a-Lago today. He and JD Vance have criticized the vice president for not doing so. When is it time for her to sit down for an interview or to hold a news conference like he did today?
Oh, she's gonna have a lot of news conferences in the weeks and months to come. I think right now, as your previous guest had mentioned, I think she's introducing herself to the public as the presidential nominee for our party. A convention is coming up, and I think there will be plenty of time for her to do press conferences now and in the future. But right now, I think what Donald Trump is really trying to do is deflect attention from her campaign because he knows that she has the momentum and she is gaining in the polls and he doesn't like it. And so he's trying to redirect attention away and distract from what is obviously a successful campaign by Kamala Harris.
Well, one of the things they've been directing us to, Congressman, is Tim Walz's military record, questioning his service. We heard about this from JD Vance yesterday, and the messaging from the Trump campaign suggested he abandoned his men before they deployed to Iraq when he went to run for Congress, that he lied about serving in combat, referring to a weapon he was holding in a gun control ad, that it was a weapon that he held in war, and that he inflated his rank. This has upset a lot of people, Congressman, on both sides of the aisle, some of whom find this type of criticism of someone's service inappropriate. And I wonder if you think he should talk about it.
Look, I think that the fact of the matter is that Tim Walz served for 24 years in the National Guard. He became an enlisted man at the age of 17. He trained numerous people on how to use their weapons for combat, and many of them did serve in conflict. And so for anybody to question his service, plus, by the way, he was the ranking member of the Veterans Affairs Committee when I served with him in the House. He's passionate about serving veterans. And so at some point he will speak about these particular, ridiculous attacks. But I think it's the height of hypocrisy for Donald Trump, who, deferred serving because of bone spurs, to then criticize someone who served for more than 2 decades in the armed forces of our country.
Well, Congressman, as you mentioned that he was the ranking member of the Veterans Affairs Committee, you are the ranking member of the China Select Committee currently. And something else we know about Governor Walz's resume is that he used to teach in China. He speaks Mandarin. Do you have an understanding of what kind of policy in regard to China he would bring to a future Harris-Walz administration?
I think that he, and of course, our future president, Kamala Harris, I think will probably bring a lot of continuity to the Biden administration's policies with regard to China, which have been very tough and smart, not only with regard to military issues, but also with regard to economic and technological ones. And so I feel very comfortable with where they're going and their approach. And for that matter, I think we should continue to adopt a bipartisan approach with regard to China, because at the end of the day, what China really wants to see is a schism between Democrats and Republicans so they can then continue to play one side off against the other.